Shalom Aleichem. Today is Or Yom Shishi, that is to say Thursday evening. Yom Shishi, Shabbat, Friday, is going to be starting now. Wow, the Tavet Toshin Pei. Well, according to our calendar, corresponding to the 25th of December 2025, according to the Gregorian calendar. And we return to Hilchot Kriyat Shema in Mishneh Torah, the Rabbi Gadol Rambam, Zichrono Livracha, Perek Gimel Halacha. Well, Tzo'ath Adam, Tzo'ath Kelovim, Hazirim, בזמן שיש בתוכן עורף, וכל צואה שריחה רע כגון אלו, אסור לקרות קריאת שמע כנגדן. All right, so here with this halacha and the following halachot, we begin various halachot and discussions regarding the nikyon hamakom. In other words, Torah may not be learnt, and therefore it follows that Kriyat Shema may not be recited in a place which is where nearby there is excrement. In this case, the Rambam discusses here Tzo'at Ha'adam. In other words, it could be human, it could be of a dog, it could be of a pig. B'zman sheyesh b'tochan oroth. Why did the Rambam mention these three specifically? Because I don't know if this is still done nowadays in certain tanning processes, but it used to be the case that in order to produce a high quality leather or parchment, which is an involved process, today also it's an involved process. I imagine today it's generally widely known around the world in many countries how this is done. I think there was a time something like 50 years ago when the Germans were particularly knowledgeable and proficient in this regard. So treating leather, creating a high quality leather is a very involved process. It depends, of course, begins with the hide itself, with the skin of the animal. But then there too, once you have the skin, the hide, there are many things that need to be done and must be done and should be done. In previous times at least, and it could still be the case, I'm not saying I know for a fact, today if this is not done, one of the mixtures or substances in which hides were treated as part of the process was in some mixture which involved excrement, whether of human origin or certain animals, because of the certain chemical properties of the excrement, just as urine also has certain chemical properties, obviously, and it's also useful for certain purposes, such as laundering stains out of clothing, etc., as is also something that was done in ancient times. Today we have other substances which replace that. They have ammonia from other sources and other substances. So now obviously these substances have a very unpleasant smell. So the entire process of treating and producing high quality leather or parchment was a very unpleasant process for the people involved. It was perhaps lucrative, but it was not a pleasant process, which is also why that a bursekai, a person who, that's the term used by Chazal to refer to such a person whose trade it is to produce leather in such ways, was often had an unpleasant smell to him, and it was difficult to, not always the case that he was able to remove that unpleasant smell. So this comes up in various contexts in the Talmud, in the Mishneh. For example, if a woman says to the Beth Din, my husband is a wonderful man, but I cannot bear the smell. There's nothing I can do about it, and he's not willing to cease being a bursakai. He's not willing to become a baker instead or something else. And I'm sorry, but we need to get divorced. This is a legitimate claim. It's unfortunate, and I hope nowadays there are better ways of doing these things, so that such issues not need to be dealt with. So Rambam is discussing, in the first instance, one of the typical contexts in which such substances, excrement from various sources, was used in order to treat and produce high quality leather. And Rambam therefore goes on here to say as follows: So'at ha'adam, wa so'at kalavim, wa hazirim. Any of these three, which were the kind that tended to be used generally for the treating and curing of leather, or any other excrement which has a similarly very unpleasant and powerful odor. Kriyat Shema. One may not recite Kriyat Shema, which is parts from the Torah, sections from the Torah that we recite. One may not recite Kriyat Shema when such substances are in front of one or in one's general vicinity. And the same is true for urine of human origin, which also has an unpleasant smell. Why? Because at least certain kinds of animals, I'm not an expert on this subject, I admit, but I imagine that there are certain kinds of animals, the urine of which animals is not very offensive in its smell. So the general rule that we're learning here, the Halacha, is that when one finds oneself in a place, in a house, in a room, in an area where there is an unpleasant stench hanging in the air, and the source of that stench is as described here, one may not recite Kriyat Shema or study or speak Divrei Torah, which are Divrei Kodesh, Divrei Kedusha, Devarim Shayachim and Osakim Berumo Shel Olam, things that are of the most sublime nature, that may not be discussed in such a place. In other words, there are aspects of this world, Olam Hazeh, which do not allow, in certain situations, in certain contexts, do not allow one to engage in Torah study. That is something which this concept comes up in the Mishneh already, and is discussed in great detail in the Talmud. Keep in mind, of course, that first of all, these things are also entirely relevant and realistic today as well, but even more so in earlier generations, when they did not have indoor plumbing and hygienic standards were not always as we are used to today, perhaps. These were very real. These were real concerns. This was the reality, and one had to know that you need to check if it's the kind of place where such substances may be present. You need to check before you begin to study Torah or to learn Torah or to recite Tefillah, etc. And therefore, because this is the reality, the next statement follows: Kotan she'eno yachol le'echol kezayis dovan, b'chdei she'yochal hagadol k'shalosh betzim dovan. In other words, a child, a small baby, a young or an infant, who is not yet of an age that he is able to eat a kezayit of dovan. A kezayit is, of course, a very small amount, 3 cc in volume. Again, the size of a smallish olive nowadays. That was a kazayth benoni, an average size olive in the time of Chazal, 3 cc, according to what I have researched and discovered. And I base this on many sources, but also on personal conversations that I had many, many years ago with Professor Mordechai Nissan, who was both a Talmid Chachamim and a Yereh Shamayim, and also a world-renowned botanist at Bar-Ilan University. And he provided me with much material regarding this matter of the kazayith and what we know about the olives that grew in Eretz Yisrael, that were the generally found, the widespread types of varieties of olives that were in Eretz Yisrael in the ancient past, 2,000 and even 3,000 years ago. There are literally in Eretz Yisrael today 7 trees in the village of Arabe in the Galil, which are approximately 3,000 years old. And they still produce olives. Amazing, but true. The olive tree is an amazing tree. So, and this I learned initially from Professor Mordechai Nissan. So a child, an infant, that is capable of eating one kazayth, in other words, a very small amount of doran. Doran literally means grain, in other words, bread, basically. We're talking about a child who can be given a small piece of bread, a very small piece of bread, to chew on, to munch on, and to swallow. In other words, this is being said in order to tell you that this is not the case with regards to the excrement of a child that is, let's say, only breastfeeding. A child, an infant, a baby that is breastfeeding only, also produces excrement, definitely, but the excrement is not particularly offensive, and therefore you may recite Kriyat Shema in a room where that is present or nearby, etc. Is when the child begins to eat other things that the characteristics of its excrement begins to change. That's what Chazal are telling you here, which is simply something that anyone can discover by experience. Katan she'no yachol le'echol kazayith doran, a child who does not eat anything, any solid food basically, bichdei she'yochal hagadol k'shalosh besim doran. We're talking therefore about a very young child that is incapable of eating that amount of bread in the time that an adult would eat the volume of 3 eggs, hen's eggs, chicken eggs of bread. En marhikim lo mitzoatho v'lo meimei raglo. One does not need to move away from or distance oneself from the excrement or the urine of such a child, which is an important thing to know. A person who has a young child in the home, this is a real world piece of information that you need to know, and therefore it follows that the excrement, the tho'ah of a katan, of a young child who is already capable of eating solid food and does so, his excrement has the same Halakhic status and the same laws apply as to the excrement of any other human being.
How long is this shiur of Kidei Achilat Pras in minutes? First of all, is this the correct shiur?
Well, it's a mahloket between various Rishonim. Rashi says arba besim, and Rambam says shalosh besim, and it's truly difficult to know who is more correct on this question. It's a very legitimate question that you ask, because this is the shiur, or the concept that Chazal referred to as eating kazayith bichdei achilat peras, or something like that, with reference to various halachot to do with fasting, or in this halacha here, for example. So the peras refers to a half. The word peras means a half of what? Of a loaf of bread, a standard loaf of bread. What is the standard loaf of bread? Well, I don't know. The standard loaf of bread that they used to have in different places 2,000 or 1,800 years ago, or more or less, Rashi says that a half was the equivalent, a loaf was the equivalent, which is, we're talking about a relatively small piece of bread, by the way. It's not a large loaf, which is the volume of 4 eggs. Now, of course, and Rambam holds that it's 3 eggs. Now, of course, it also depends on how you, what you imagine an egg to be, what the volume of an egg to be. Just as there are people who will tell you that a kazayith, the volume of an olive, is, just say, not just for argument's sake, in reality, this is what some people will tell you, that it's 56 cc. I'm sorry, no, they will say it's 28 cc, because they consider a besa to be 56, and they consider a kazayith to be half of a besa, which is obviously not correct, but that's what they claim. So therefore, a kazayith becomes magically 28 cc, which is also not a huge amount, but and if you imagine, so that's bad enough. But if you imagine that an egg is the shiur of a beta is 60 or 65 cc, then that also that's not the same as if you imagine that an egg is 48 cc, which was the average chicken egg in the time of Chazal, because the size of the egg depends on the type of chicken involved. There are many. I think once I looked it up, something like 200 types of chicken, at least, that I was able to investigate and to look at, and the various and the sizes and colors are a huge variation. And the size of the egg depends on the size and the type of chicken involved. The average, what is called here in Eretz Yisrael, Tanagolet Aravith, a small, scrawny, black chicken, the kind that you might find in certain villages in the Middle East, is a much smaller egg than the large size egg that you buy in the supermarket. The reason that we know that it's approximately 48 cc is because of a particular Roman measure, which we know how many eggs that is, and because it was made, there's such a measure, which is a measure of volume, was there were vessels that were created in using iron or bronze to measure out that volume, and some of them have survived, and therefore we know exactly what that measure was. So we're talking about something like 48 cc at the most. In fact, I can tell you that decades ago, I went to the well, I won't say bother, but I made the effort to, I contacted certain people who were able to bring me these eggs from small, scrawny black chickens. And I measured them, and they were actually less than 48. They were more like 45, 44 cc. Quite small. And anyway, so that's the size we're talking about. No, so in simple terms, an adult who takes a large bite of bread, that's basically a large mouthful is the volume of an egg, and therefore we're talking about 3 times that volume or 4 times that volume. Very well. Halacha Zayin. Hayathat so'a yivesha kahares. What happens if you have excrement? Again, it can be of various origins. It could be human, it could be of a dog or another animal. And when it's fresh, it has a very unpleasant odor. But eventually, over time, if it sits out there in the field, shall we say, or in the yard, eventually it becomes dry, and eventually it becomes extremely dry. So if it becomes yevesha kaheres, to the point that it cracks and breaks it breaks down into pieces if it's touched. So let's say you take a stick and you prod it and it falls apart. So that's called yevesha kaheres. And at that point, it is much less, not nearly as unpleasant. Nevertheless, the halacha is asur likrot kenegda ואם הייתה יבשה יותר מכחרס עד שאם זרקה תתפרר הרי היא כעפר ומותר לקרות כנגדה. So kaheres means that it's quite dry, but not completely. What usually happens, of course, is that it dries from the outside in, and therefore inside it's still not quite dry. So it still has the halachic status and definition of thu'ah, of excrement. If, however, it is so dry that if you touch it, literally, it's like dust, and then it's considered, as Rambam says, harehi ka'afar, or mutali kroth kenegda, and then it's just like earth or any other nondescript substance. In other words, obviously, the point is that if it's malodorous, then it's a thu'ah, and if it's not, it's not. That's the definition. Meraglaim shenivla'u b'karka. Now, what about urine that was absorbed into the ground? The person urinated on the ground. Now the question is whether you have to remove yourself from that place a certain distance in order to study Torah, to daven, recite Kriyat Shema, etc. מרגליים שנבלעו בקרקע, אם היו מרטיבים היד, אסור לקרות כנגדם. There's another girsah here, just a moment. In front of me in this sefer, which is this one here, it says, מרגליים שנבלעו בקרקע. So there was urine, it was absorbed into the ground. If it's still damp enough that if you were to touch it with your hand, it would you would experience some wetness. In other words, it's not totally dry. Asur likroth kenegdam, then it's asur to do so. Ve'im en meratavim hayad mutar. I should say meratavim, not merativin. Meraglan shnivu b'karka, im hayu meratavim hayad, asur likroth kenegdam. Ve'im en meratavim hayad mutar. In other words, if the ground has totally dried, then it's mutar. Then it's as if that urine is no longer there. The girasah here in on the screen before us is meraglaim shenivla'u b'karka im haya rishuman nikar, which is quite a different concept. In other words, although perhaps in practice it's not very different in terms of, because we're searching for a definition of dryness essentially. So im haya rishuman nikar, if the place where the urine hit the ground is still discernible. In other words, one can see that it was wet at one point. If that is still the case, it's still discernible. I've just been reading for a moment the footnote here that Rabbi David writes here, and he points out, even though that in the Mahadura, the edition of Moreh Rav Gafeh, and you find the Girsah we have here before us on the screen, which is in fact what appears in some of the Kidveyat HaTemanim, some of the Yemenite manuscripts. But Rav Shilat points out that there are Kidveyat Temanim, ancient Kidveyat Temanim, ancient Yemenite manuscripts, where this girasah that I have before me, in other words, where it says "Im hayu meratavim hayad asur likrot kenegdam," appears instead of the nusach that we have here about rishumam nikar, and that he claims, and this is also how it appears in Aleph. Aleph is the kitav yad that we have of Oxford, Aleph for Oxford, at the end of which Rambam signed in his own hand that this copy was checked against my own personal copy. Lichora, you can't ask for a better testimony, and proof of providence than that. So that is the nusach, which is more likely to be correct. I would agree with Rabbi Shilo, that's the case. In practical terms, I don't know if it makes a huge difference. But apparently Rambam thought it was worth checking or rather correcting, because that in this Ktav Yad Aleph, Oxford, it was, the original Nusach was as it appears here on the screen before us, and it was changed. So Rambam deliberately changed it. That's what I can tell you about these two Nuschaot. But in practice, I say the difference is unlikely to be very significant, because if I think that there may be a difference in terms of the time factor. In other words, Meratavim Hayad means that if you touch it, you will feel dampness. So today, if you don't want to use your hand, you could take a tissue, shall we say, some tissue, and put it on the ground there and see if it comes up damp or not. But the Rishuman Nikar, that may last, that the fact that it's discernible that there was this wetness at this point on the ground, that may remain longer, how much longer I cannot say, than real actual dampness. So that's apparently is the difference. But I'm not sure the difference would be huge. And the concept, at least, is straightforward enough.
So even if they don't have a bad smell, as long as it's still visible or still moist, or if the tzoa is dry but not completely disintegrated, would be asur.
Well, I think it's not because I think these things go together. In other words, once it's totally dry, then there will no longer be a smell. And once there is and if there is a smell, it's apparently not totally dry. Now, one could test this, I suppose, in a laboratory setting. I'm not sure how you would, if you're interested in looking into this as a practical matter, but it could be tested.
There are a lot of cows near where I grew up, so
Cows?
Cows, yes, that leave droppings. So
all right. Well,
it seems to me that once they're dry, they don't smell, even if they're solid and not disintegrated.
Cow droppings, once they become dry, really are not really offensive, as far as I'm aware. And the same is probably true of the urine, which once, if it's totally dried up, then it's probably not offensive. But at any rate, it's clear that the fundamental test is the existence or lack of an unpleasant smell. That's the bottom line.
Do you think that's a sufficient explanation as to why the Rambam didn't list many of the other creatures that Chazal tell us about, that you can be or read Shema next to their Torah or not?
It might be. I'm not sure why the Rambam did not mention other types of animals. Not clear, I would say. Perhaps because they're less common. Human beings are not always, not usually have such animals when they're in close proximity to themselves. But it's good to know. But again, the ikar is the essential yardstick, is the either the existence of or the lack of an unpleasant odor. Halakhic. Kama yarhik mitza'a u'mimei raglayim v'halakhic yikra. Arba'amoth. This is straight out of the Mishneh, where it says in Masechet Berachot that, which is where the entire concept originates. In other words, this concept, this idea, is to be found in the Mishneh, that, and it's not only, by the way, excrement or urine. The Mishnah and the Talmud also discuss other things like mishra, which is flax. Flax, in order to produce flax, it has to be soaked for a long period until it begins to decompose to some extent, and it creates a very unpleasant smell. So any kind of a very unpleasant smell is part of these halachot, is included within the framework and within the purview of these halachot. So how far does one have to remove oneself from such substances? Arba'a moth is approximately 2 meters. Perhaps technically a little bit less, but not very much less. So the assumption being that 2 meters away you will not experience this unpleasant odor. But if you do, it's still asur. But that's not usually the case. באמת דברים אמורים בזמן שהם מלאחרו או מסדדו. This is the case when these substances are behind you or off to the side. In other words, you're not looking at them, not staring you in the face. אבל אם היו כנגד פנו או מרחיק מהם עד שלא יראה אותן ואחר כך יקרא. But in other words, if any such substance is in front of you, you either have to turn away or reverse your position or something, or you have to move so far away that it's no longer visible. It's no longer in your field of vision. So there it's already, you see, not a question of the odor, it's a question of, it's the thing itself being in your line of sight, in your field of vision, that is also considered lo lefi kvod Torah, that you should recite Torah when you're staring at such a thing. Halakhat toif. Bama devarim amurim. Now all of this that we've just discussed, b'shaya imahen b'bayit, b'makom shaweh or shaweh. In other words, all this is assuming that you are in the same house. The word babayit should be translated here as room. You're in the same room as these substances, and it's on the floor. You're sitting nearby, and it's on the floor in the same room where you are. Aval ima yasham makom gavoah. If, however, there is a raised area in that house or room, gavoah mehen asarat tefahim or namuch mehen asarat tefahim, which is 80 centimeters roughly. Yoshev b'sad hamakom v'koreh sharei nifsak benehem. In other words, here we have the concept which appears in the Mishneh and the Talmud in many contexts, that asarat tefahim is considered reshut b'fnei asma. It's already considered a different reshut. It's not considered to be in the same space. It's a separate space. It has its own separate existence. Once it's 80 centimeters above where you are or below where you are. So there could also be a pit next to you. You could be sitting in a place, a room, wherever it may, or outside, and there could be a pit. And in this pit, which is 80 or more centimeters deep, there are these various offensive substances. However, if they're separate from you and you do not experience the unpleasant smell, then you can ignore them. So that's what this halacha is all about. Im haya sham makom gavoah mehen asarat tefahim or namuch mehen asarat tefahim, yoshev b'tzad hamakom v'koreh sharei nifsak benehem. This is not considered to be in the same reshut, just like in the Reshut Rabim above asarat tefahim, Hilchot Shabbat, Eruvin, above Hilchot asarat tefahim is considered already not considered to be Reshut Rabim, because it's not where the Rabbim go or walk or move along. It's a separate dimension, so to speak. V'chen, V'hu, and all this is on condition, V'hu shelo yagi'a lo re'ah ra'. And this is all on the assumption, as we said before, that the unpleasant odor does not reach you. In other words, from this you understand that wherever you're in a situation where an unpleasant odor is present, and it's not something you can ignore, then all these halachot apply, even if it's more than arba'a moth, etc. V'chen im kafa kali al hatzoa. Now, another thing that one might do, if one has some kind of a vessel, let's say a bowl of some kind, which one can place over this piece of excrement, which is on the floor of the room in which you are situated. Im kafa kali al hatzoa or memerak laim, or the same applies to urine on the floor. Afal pishen imo babayit, even though they're in the same room, the same space as you, the same dimension. Hare elu kikevurim umutar likrot bahem. They because they're not visible, and they're in a separate dimension, a separate space, because they've been covered and they're separate from where you are. It's as if they're buried in the ground, and therefore it's mutar to study Torah, to recite Kriyat Shema, etc. in that situation. Now, what about when there is a separation, but it's still visible? Haya beno uven athoa mechitha shel zechuchit. So there is a wall or a window made of glass between you and this excrement. It may be quite near to you, but they're separate from you. So you can't, even if you wanted to, you couldn't reach out and touch it, shall we say, but you can see it. Nevertheless, even though you can see it, it's visible, you may read Kriyat Shema, because it's in a separate space. So we see the ikar is the fact that it's in a separate reshut. נתן רביעית מים לתוך מרגליים של פעם אחת, מותר לקרוא עמהן בתוך 400. If one finds oneself in a room where, let's say, as a young child urinated, you can either clean it up, or you can also do something else. If you need to read Kriyat Shema or study Torah or recite Birkat HaMazon or what have you immediately, what can you do? If you pour 1 reve'ith of water, which is not very much, which is 75 cc of water, l'toch men raglaim shel pam achat, in other words, an average amount that an adult will produce in one time of urine, mutar likroth imahen b'toch 400. Then that amount of water is considered to have been mevatel, to nullify, and negate the status of that liquid as being merak lime. It is now considered basically water. Again, I understand that this is all on the assumption, as we said before, shelo yagi'a lo re'ach ra. And therefore, as a logical extension, continuation of what we just said, in Halacha Yod Aleph, hayatha so'a be'ghuma. So let's say a person it could be outside in the field, it could be in the home as well. How could it be in the home? Keep in mind that most people, in the time of the Mikdash, the time of the Mishnah, the time of the Talmud, most people lived in homes, the floors of which were made of beaten earth. Only wealthy people could afford to tile their homes with stone or marble or what have you. I'm sorry, no. So if there was some excrement, but it's in a depression in the floor. There's a hole in the floor, a depression in the floor, and that's where the excrement is. Omed b'sandalo ala guma. We're correct. One can place one's shoe over that hole and thus cover it up, and now it's as if it's buried, it's hidden. As long as you are not touching it. In other words, if you are in direct physical contact with that excrement, then no. But if it's the depression is such that you can cover it with your shoe but without touching it, then as long as you stand in that position, you can recite Kriyat Shema or study Torah or say a bracha, etc. If we're talking about a very, very small amount of excrement, Rambam says, just a very, very, like a drop. What does that mean? A crumb, something, shall we say, the size of a pebble or something. Rokek aleha, rok ave, ad shetitkaseh v'koreh. If you can cover it up with spittle or phlegm or any such substance, which is not offensive, has not got the same status as tho'a or meraglaim, if you can cover it up with such a thing, and so that it is overlaid with the spittle or with the phlegm or what have you, then that's also acceptable. Wakora, you can read Kriyat Shema in that situation. Rambam continues. Hayatha natishat so'a al basaro. A person defecated and he's not completely clean. There is a small amount, a very, very minimal amount of excrement still on his person. Or alternately, his hands, because he did clean himself thoroughly, his hands are not clean. In other words, there's a certain amount of excrement on his hands. However, there is no, because of the very, very small amount involved, there's no discernible unpleasant odor. Or either because of the very small amount or because it's dry. Mutar likroth, it's mutar to read Kriyat Shema in that situation. Lefi she'en la re'ah. Furthermore, Rambam says, Avalim hayatha bimkoma. If, however, in other words, what we discussed before, and Rambam said, Natishat so'a al basaro, he's not referring to a person who did not clean himself thoroughly after defecating. But somehow, some excrement ended up on his leg or on his arm or what have you. But a very tiny amount, such that it's not noticeable. In that situation, that's what we just read, it's mutar to read Kriyat Shema. Why? Because even though you're aware of its existence, but it's for all practical purposes, it can be ignored. It's not noticeable. But if a person did not clean himself thoroughly, if he stands, it's not visible. But it is if he's not standing. In that case, a person may not read Kriyat Shema, or study Torah, or recite bracha. The assumption is that as long as it's not completely dry, it will be very unpleasant and have an unpleasant odor. Rambam adds, "V'chama geonim horu," and there are geonim who posek she'asur lo likroth im haya yado matunafot v'chach ra'ui la'asoth. There are geonim who wrote in Teshuvoth that even if a person's hands, as we said, were not entirely clean, but Rambam said previously that we're talking about a very small amount, and there's no obvious, discernible, unpleasant odor, that it's mutar to read Kriyat Shema. But there are geonim who were more mahmir, who said, as long as he's aware of the fact that his hands are not entirely clean, he has to must refrain from saying any davar shabi kedusha until he washes his hands thoroughly. And Rambam here says it's, even though he doesn't think it's min hadin perhaps legamre, but it's definitely proper to do so.
But apart from these cases, even if one is machmir to the opinion of the Geonim, if one's hands are not dirty, as in immediately after waking up, it seems like one wouldn't need to wash them before needing to learn Torah or say bracha.
I don't understand the question. A person woke up from sleep,
Yes,
and you're asking if he can immediately read Kriyat Shema?
yes. If his hands are not so dirty.
No. According to Rambam, no. We saw.
No. I mean, or say any bracha at all.
Okay. So to be more to answer the question fully, if you, as we saw previously, at the beginning of this perek Gimel, Rambam said, "Hakoreh Kriyat Shema, rohes yadav b'mayim kodem sheikra." Even though it's not very clear from the Talmud or from the Mishnah that this is so, Rambam's view is, based at least on some of the Geonim, that Kriyat Shema, like Tefillah, one does not recite without doing the Tilat Yodayim. But this does not apply to Birkot HaShahar. Quite obviously not. From what Rambam himself writes later in Hilchot Tefillah, Perek Tishri, it's very, Perek Shvi'i, it's very clear that you recite, if you do not, if a person is not, does not need to rush to the toilet as soon as he wakes up, and one wakes up, one can recite various brachot, such as Mahaya Methim, Hamahazin Shabbat Yifcharim Methim, or Pokah Imurim, or what have you, or Matira Surim, etc. Rambam only mentioned here Kriyat Shema, not all brachot. That's the view of Rambam. It's entirely true that some of the Geonim certainly did not agree with Rambam on this. Rav Natronai Gaon is famous for claiming otherwise, and Rav Amram Gaon in his Sidur quotes Rav Natronai Gaon extensively on this, and obviously therefore agrees with him. But it's correct to point out that Rav Sa'adia Gaon does not quote Rav Natronai Gaon and does not say any such thing. So it was obviously not agreed to by all. What did Rav Natronai Gaon hold? Rav Natronai Gaon held that we assume that when asleep, one is not responsible. One cannot be held responsible or be aware of what one's hands get up to. And one's hands, we assume, not to be fit in order to recite any bracha, to take the name of Hashem at all, until one washes one's hands. That's what Rav Natronai Gaon says, and that became the standard Halachic position, which you find in many other Rishonim after that time. But that is not the pshat of what we find in the Talmud, and Rambam does not accept such a claim. So, with regards to this particular question of a person who went to the toilet and his hands are not entirely clean, they're not obviously dirty either, not really, not in a very significant way, but his hands could be cleaner, shall we say. So there were Geonim who said that one should not recite Kriyat Shema, and it follows also any bracha or any limud or anything at all in that situation before one washes one's hands thoroughly. And Rambam says here, and that is proper and correct, even though you cannot prove it from the Sugya that this is the case. Because from the Sugyot, it appears that at least with the Abad, if one's hands are, if there's no re'ah ra, as Rambam said previously, lefi she'en la re'ah, that's the essential litmus test. And now Rambam goes on to say in Halakhic that basically spells out that which we said previously. Because Rambam here says, Re'ah ra' sheyesh lo ikar. In other words, you enter a room and you discern that there is an unpleasant odor in the air. And it has an ikar. Ikar means that you can also see why. On the floor there's excrement. You can see why. What do you do? Marhik arba amorth v'koreh. In order to recite Kriyat Shema, you have to remove yourself, distance yourself from that source of this unpleasant odor, arba amorth, 2 meters, and then you can recite Kriyat Shema or study Torah, etc. Im, and this is on the condition, im pasak hareach, assuming that 2 meters is sufficient to no longer experience that unpleasant odor. V'im lo pasak, however, let's say you moved 2 meters away, you moved arba amorth away, and you can still discern this unpleasant smell. Im lo pasak marhik ad makom sheposek. Then you have to move further away until, as we said before, we see that the ikar is whether there is a re'ah ra or not. V'she'en lo ikar. Now, if you enter a room or a place, you're in a situation where there is an unpleasant smell, but there's no obvious source. You don't know where it's coming from. Such as a person who broke wind. So then a person has to remove himself from that place, from that area, in other words, until the unpleasant smell is no longer discernible. Now, as we said before, in ancient times, they didn't have indoor plumbing, etc. So what did people do? They had various vessels in which they defecated, urinated, and eventually that was removed from the house or emptied, etc. Garaf shel ra'i, or geref shel ra'i, that is some kind of a chamber, what we would call a chamber pot, perhaps. Wa'avit shel meraglaim, and a kind of barrel or container or jug in which people urinated. And these were often in the house, let's say in the early morning, certainly until things were removed and emptied and cleaned. Asur likrot Kriyat Shema kenegdan. You're not allowed to, not only, you do not see the excrement or the urine, but you are, they're right in front of you. Asur likrot kenegdan. Af al pisha en behem klum, wa en lehem reach, even though they are now at this moment empty. And there is no discernible unpleasant odor. Here we have a very interesting and important concept, because they have the din of a bet kiseh. In other words, just as it is clear to us, based on what we've been discussing here, that one cannot recite Kriyat Shema or recite Tefillah or Baracha, etc., study Torah in the toilet. Let's say, for argument, in order to make it clear what was a toilet in those days, it was what we call an outhouse. So the entire outhouse, all of it, including the walls of it, which are usually made of wood, they all have a din of tha'ah. They're all considered to be infused with excrement, and you have to distance yourself from, not just from with the area described by the partitions of that outhouse, but you also have to move away a certain distance from the outhouse itself. I'm stressing the word outhouse here because in a moment I'll mention how our current reality is different. It may not be different. One can be in a situation where there is no plumbing and no toilet, etc. But normally we find ourselves in a situation where we do have such facilities. But in ancient times, that was clearly not the case. So this halacha tells us that a garaf or geref shel ra'i, in other words, a chamber pot that is used for defecation, or a vessel, some kind of jug or what have you, which is used for urination, even though at this moment they are empty and there's no discernible unpleasant odor in the room near them. Nevertheless, if they're in front of you, facing them, you cannot recite Kriyat Shema, you cannot study Torah, you cannot make a bracha, you cannot say Birkat Hamazon. Again, keep in mind, very often in ancient times, a home was one large room. And perhaps not so large, but even if it was large, it was often just one room. And so you could be on one side of the room or the home. You may have eaten and now you want to recite Birkat Hamazon, for example. But across the room, there's this Geref Shel Re'i, there's this chamber pot. So now in those days, what were these things made of? They were not made of stainless steel. They were not made of glass, which I mentioned these because these are substances which do not absorb. But they were made of heres, of porous, very porous earthenware, simple earthenware usually. And such a thing absorbs various substances into the matter, the material of the vessel itself, and the entire vessel has a din, has the Halakhic status of a bet hakiseh, as Rambam says, mipnei she'en kebet hakiseh. Now the question is, our present kind of toilet with internal plumbing in the house, and where the excrement, etc., are flushed away and removed, and assuming that the toilet bowl, etc., is very clean, totally clean. Does that facility, does that device, that toilet bowl, etc., does that have a din of a bet hakiseh? B'chora, no, it does not. It does not absorb like an earthenware chamber pot. The Chazon Ish discusses this in some detail, and he explains why the bet hakiseh, the various posukim discuss the bet hakiseh, and that the walls of as I said, the exterior walls of the bet hakiseh also have a din of bet hakiseh, and you have to be at least arba amot away from that as well. And so the Chazon Ish explains this is because the wooden wall is also often dirty on the inside. It's considered to be balua. In other words, it's all considered to be infused with such substances. So you have to remove yourself completely from that thing. But in our kind of situation, the fact is that some of these halachot do not apply in the same way. Because and the fact, it's true, I'm not suggesting that you should be able to study Torah or recite Kriyat Shema inside a toilet, or daven there or something like that, even though it's entirely clear. It may be spotless and be very fragrant, but nevertheless, it's not a place where it's mutar to study Torah. That's true, which is halacha that we'll perhaps we've discussed, and we'll see later. But it's also not that it doesn't mean, on the other hand, that it has the same din as what we're discussing here. It basically has a din of bet kiseh de parsa'eh, as discussed in the Talmud, where the offensive material is taken away. It doesn't remain in one place, in one pit in the ground, but it's actually removed. In our case, it's even removed much more thoroughly and completely. So those are some of the things you need to keep in mind with regards to the halachic status of our batei kiseh today, or our bathrooms, our toilets. This also therefore means, for example, that even if you hold, even though it's not clear that this is true, but let's say you hold that it's asur to do netilat yodayim in a bet kiseh, if one is in a room in which there is a toilet, but the room is entirely clean, and there's no it, and there's no unpleasant smell. That room does not have a din of a bet hakiseh. It may have been used as a bet hakiseh 5 moments ago, but right now, if it's entirely clean and fragrant, has no din of bet hakiseh, and you can wash your hands in that place. Even if you in a real bet kiseh, what used to be a bet kiseh, you may claim otherwise. That is something also to keep in mind. Tov, we shall end here for today. Heyu beruchim, hizku, v'yames levavchem, kol hamiyhalim, l'Adonai, shalom, v'nisachon.